I fell in love with a ghost, and tonight he might just vanish for good. It's a ridiculous thing to say, isn't it? To even think. But here I am, staring at the exact spot where his shoulder should be, watching the moonlight cut a path straight through him like he's nothing more than a wisp of fog and a fading memory. He tries to smile, that same crooked grin that made me trip over my own heart the first time I saw it, but the edges of him keep blurring, shimmering like heat haze off asphalt. It's a painful kind of beautiful, this slow disintegration. I moved into this house exactly 1 year ago today, convinced I was finally buying myself a fresh start, a clean slate. Turns out, I was also inheriting a 100-year-old heartbreak that absolutely refuses to leave. And somehow, I've managed to entangle my own messy heart right into it. So if you've ever felt a sudden, inexplicable cold spot in your room that felt almost gentle like a phantom touch, or if you've ever whispered stay to someone nobody else could possibly see, then you need to keep listening. I need to tell you how we got here, how a perfectly ordinary, if slightly cynical, woman ended up falling for a man who's been dead for over a century before he disappears completely, taking our story with him. The realtor, bless her overly enthusiastic heart, called this place a fixer-upper dream. She probably imagined me with a Pinterest board full of shabby chic ideas, ripping out original fixtures to replace them with modern farmhouse monstrosities. Me? I called it the only place I could afford after my life imploded. Completely spectacularly imploded. New job, new city, new me classic cliche, right? The kind of narrative you tell yourself in the mirror until you almost believe it. The first night, I dragged my mattress onto the living room floor because the stairs creaked like they were gossiping about me, every groan and pop a judgment on my life choices. I was lonely, a deep, bone-aching kind of lonely, but I rationalized it. Told myself that was safer than being heartbroken again, safer than inviting another person into the carefully constructed fortress of my solitude. Loneliness, at least, was predictable. It didn't leave surprise notes on the fridge or suddenly decide it was time to move on. Around 3:12 a.m., I remember the time because I was scrolling aimlessly through my phone, too restless to sleep. The air in the room went arctic. Not just cool, but a deep, penetrating chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then the single overhead bulb, a bare, dusty filament, flashed twice. A quick, almost playful blink. My first thought? Great. Old wiring, old house, old problems. Just what I needed. But then a scent drifted in, subtle yet distinct. Cedar and strong, freshly brewed coffee. It was comforting and possibly so, and completely out of place in my empty, unpacked house. And I swear, someone gently tucked the blanket tighter around my shoulders. It wasn't a dream. I felt the slight pressure, the careful adjustment. That night, despite the chill and the strangeness, I slept deeper than I had in months, wrapped in a mysterious warmth. The next morning, my favorite chipped mug, the one I'd been meaning to wash for days, sat sparkling clean in the dish rack. But here's the kicker. I hadn't even unpacked any dishes yet. They were still in boxes somewhere. A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't fear. More like disbelief mixed with a strange amusement. I laughed out loud, a slightly nervous, disbelieving sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Okay, ghost," I remember saying, half joking, half daring. "If you're real, load the dishwasher." A beat of silence. Then from the kitchen, the distinct, delicate clink of plates. Not crashing, not rattling, but a soft, almost cheerful chime, like they were chuckling with me. That should have terrified me. Logically, it should have sent me screaming for the hills, calling an exorcist, or at the very least, packing my bags. Instead, I felt noticed. Pathetic, right? A 28-year-old woman, independent and supposedly self-sufficient, so starved for company that even poltergeist activity felt like flirting. It was embarrassing, but also undeniable. Someone or something was here, and it wasn't trying to scare me. It was helping. And in my isolated, heartbroken state, that felt strangely, wonderfully, like a lifeline. I found myself leaning out my laundry, half expecting it to be folded. It wasn't, usually, but the mug, always clean. It was a strange, silent negotiation, a peculiar comfort in the quiet of my new old house. I started leaving little notes, silly things like, "Could you move that box of books?" My back is killing me, and sometimes, just sometimes, the box would be nudged a few inches. It was a game, a secret I kept, and it filled the silence that had felt so suffocating just days before. 1 week later, I was deep into painting the bedroom, trying to transform the depressing beige into a color I optimistically called overripe peaches. The reality was probably closer to a sickly salmon, but hope springs eternal, even with paint. Roller in hand, humming off key to whatever playlist promised courage and good vibes, probably some early 2000s pop punk. I was in my own little world, splattering more paint on myself than on the walls. Behind me, a voice, soft as dust motes dancing in sunlight, finished the lyric I'd forgotten. Not just finished it, but sang it perfectly, with a subtle, melodic tremor that made my heart do a startled little flip. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, the roller flying from my hand and splattering tiny, peachy sunrises across the newly cleaned floorboards, and there he was. He stood no. He hovered, tall and lean, dressed in suspenders and a crisp white shirt that looked like it belonged in a history textbook, not my freshly painted bedroom. His eyes, though, were what really caught me. They were the color of storm glass, shifting and deep, holding centuries of unspoken stories. "Sorry," he said, his voice a low rumble, sounding genuinely shocked that I could hear him, that I could see him. I just stared, dumbfounded, the roller clattering to the floor. My brain was screaming, "Ghost, ghost, run." But my feet were glued, and my mouth was dry. I waited for the panic, for the terror, for the primal urge to flee. Instead, a wave of intense, almost overwhelming curiosity flooded in, drowning out the fear. My heart hammered, but it wasn't from fright. It was anticipation. Name? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper, a ridiculous question given the circumstances. "Elias," he answered, the word sounding like it had been waiting in my mouth, a name I'd known without knowing. He glanced down at himself, a subtle, self-conscious gesture, then back at me, his storm glass eyes widening fractionally. He whispered, almost to himself, "You can see me." I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until it rushed out of me in a shaky sigh. Apparently, I managed, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "And you can finish off-key Taylor Swift?" He laughed then, a sound like porch wind chimes on a breezy summer evening, light and clear and utterly captivating. And just like that, the suffocating tension snapped. That was the first time I noticed the thin, almost invisible scar that arced gracefully across his left cheekbone. It was a faint line, a story hinted at, and in that instant, I had an insane, undeniable urge to reach out and touch it, to trace its history. Which, let's be honest, was completely insane. I mean, he was a ghost. Instead, I went for the sensible, if slightly absurd, question. "Are you going to murder me?" He looked genuinely offended, his translucent brow furrowing. "I'm dead," he said, with an air of dignified exasperation. Not rude. I snorted, then burst into a fit of laughter. It was a raw, uninhibited sound, shaking off weeks of loneliness and self-pity. Great. Just great. Flirt with the ghost. Very professional. But in that moment, with the peach paint splattered around us and the faint scent of cedar and coffee lingering, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen, truly seen, by someone who literally saw through me. Over the next month, we meticulously worked out the rules of our peculiar cohabitation. It was a strange, delicate dance of discovery. Elias, I learned, could move small things, but it required immense concentration. I'd watch, fascinated, as his outline would shimmer and dim, his form growing almost transparent, like a dying star, as he focused all his spectral energy on nudging a book off a shelf or closing a cupboard door. The effort clearly exhausted him. He'd appear even more translucent afterward, taking a moment to regain his ethereal solidity. He absolutely hated the vacuum cleaner, referring to it with a theatrical shudder as something that hurts in the teeth. I imagined it was the vibration, the sheer physical force of it disturbing his delicate, energetic state. He loved music, any music. From the soulful wail of jazz trumpets to the pulsing beats of synth pop, he absorbed it all. I'd blast everything from my ancient vinyl collection to obscure Spotify playlists, just to watch him sway, eyes closed, his translucent lashes fluttering like butterfly wings. In those moments, he looked almost completely human, completely alive, lost in the rhythm. His presence would brighten, his form gaining a fleeting solidity, as if the music itself nourished him. In exchange for these impromptu concerts, he told me stories. Stories that peeled back the layers of this old house, of this old city. He spoke of 1901, when ice was delivered by horse-drawn wagon down these very streets, the clatter of hooves echoing through time. He recounted the harrowing year of 1918, when the influenza pandemic swept through, stealing neighbors so fast that coffins outnumbered chairs at funerals. His voice would grow quiet, tinged with a sorrow that still resonated a century later, as he spoke of the fear, the loss, the sheer helplessness of it all. He had been 27, he told me, a newspaper cartoonist with a sharp wit and an even sharper pen. He sketched anti-war cartoons, biting social commentary that ruffled feathers in a time of intense nationalism. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and that, he learned, came with a price. He had been punched in alleys for his convictions, his ideals leaving physical marks on his living body. One brutal winter night, 5 men waited for him. The river, he said, was frozen solid, reflecting the cold and different stars. The rest he left unsaid, but I could guess. A brutal, senseless end. He showed me the room where the floorboards still bore a dark, indelible stain, a patch of wood he refused to discuss, his spectral gaze always sliding past it. The weight of that unspoken history hung in the air, heavy and mournful, and I, in turn, found myself confiding in him. I told him about my father's gambling addiction, the way it had shaped my childhood, leaving a permanent scar of insecurity. I spoke of my ex-fiance, the endless stream of manipulative texts, the slow, agonizing realization that I kept picking people who ultimately left, who abandoned me. Elias listened without blinking. Hard to blink when you're made of projection, I suppose, but his whole form softened like candle wax bending toward a comforting heat. His presence became a warm, steady anchor in my often turbulent internal world. I started talking just to keep him there, to fill the silence with my own vulnerabilities, knowing he understood, knowing he wouldn't judge. Loneliness, I realized, is a powerful magnet, but so is attention, genuine, unwavering attention. Somewhere between sharing takeout Thai on the living room floor and late-night debates over which decade had the best sandwiches, he was firmly pro-1920s deli. I argued for a modern gourmet approach. I realized something profound and slightly alarming. I was playing my evenings, my entire life, around a man who couldn't even hold a sandwich, much less eat one. He was becoming my confidant, my companion, my anchor. The lines between living and spectral, between friendship and something far deeper, were blurring with every shared story, every silent moment of understanding. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly, irrevocably real. It happened during a thunderstorm, one of those violent summer squalls that rattle the very foundations of old houses. The kind that makes you feel utterly small and vulnerable. The power died with a dramatic flash and a resounding crack, plunging the house into immediate, suffocating darkness. I fumbled frantically for candles, my hands shaking slightly, the sudden blackness unnerving. Elias, sensing my unease, drifted closer, his form flickering with the ambient light from the distant lightning flashes, his face momentarily illuminated in a ghostly gold. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low, tremulous whisper that cut through the drumming rain, sounding almost hesitant, like he was asking permission for something monumental, something forbidden. I nodded, my throat tight, not knowing what permission I just granted, but knowing instinctively that whatever it was, I wanted it, desperately. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then slowly, tentatively placed it over mine. It wasn't a solid touch, not in a way a living hand would feel. It was more like cold mist, a gentle, ethereal pressure that somehow, miraculously, steadied the tremor in my wrists. But then something extraordinary happened. Energy, warm and fizzy, like champagne bubbling in my veins, zipped up my arm. It wasn't just cold mist. It was an electric current, a jolt of pure, undeniable connection. It was a sensation that transcended physics, a paradox of warmth from cold, of solid from ethereal. We stayed like that, pseudo hand in hand, while thunder rolled ominously over the roof, shaking the very timbers of the house. The rain hammered against the windows, a wild primal symphony, but all I could hear was the frantic beat of my own heart, echoing the impossible connection I felt. I wanted more. I wanted to pull him closer, to feel the full, undeniable weight of him, to bridge the impossible chasm between our worlds. My entire being yearned for it. But when I looked at him, his storm glass eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He looked terrified he'd already taken too much, that this fragile, fleeting connection had somehow crossed a line he shouldn't have. After that, every glance between us felt charged, every shared silence thick with unspoken longing. It was a promise, a silent vow, a yearning for something neither of us could fully collect, fully possess. The air between us crackled with a new kind of tension, a delicate dance of restraint and desire. We were two souls, separated by the thinnest veil of existence, aching to touch, to truly connect, knowing that such a connection might shatter everything. The house, once merely a shelter, now felt like a stage for an impossible, heart-wrenching drama, and we were its unwitting, entangled players. Then came the morning I woke to find him more translucent than tracing paper. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a sudden, horrifying shift. The light filtering through the attic window seemed to pass right through him, leaving him barely a shimmering outline. "Elias?" I whispered, my voice thick with a fear I hadn't known until that exact moment. He tried to answer, his voice cracking like old vinyl, a sound that tore at my heart. It was a struggle to even form the words. He gestured weakly to his chest, and I saw it. A coin-sized hole of pure nothingness had appeared right where his heart should be. A void, a literal absence in his spectral form. In a moment of pure, unthinking panic, I reached out. My fingers met nothing but air, colder than February rain, passing straight through the gaping hole. It was a visceral, sickening sensation, the ultimate confirmation of his fading, of his precarious hold on this reality. Panic, cold and sharp, hollowed me out, leaving me breathless and dizzy. "Happens sometimes," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a sound. "I'm forgetting myself, forgetting himself." The words echoed in my mind, a terrifying prophecy. I scrambled for my laptop, my fingers trembling as I typed "ghost disappearing" into the search bar. Frantic bites of cereal forgotten on my spoon. The results were a grim litany: unfinished business, lost objects, emotional anchors. None of the articles offered any practical advice like fall hopelessly in love with a living woman and try to keep him from evaporating. That, apparently, was uncharted territory. I made lists, frantic, desperate lists of everything Elias had ever mentioned. Every detail of his life, every person, every place. We tore the attic apart, a frantic, dust-filled whirlwind, searching for anything that might be tying him here, anything that could serve as an anchor. We found yellowed cartoons, brittle with age, his distinctive signature still clear. A cracked fountain pen, its nib dried and useless, but a tangible link to his craft. And finally, a locket, tarnished silver, with a portrait inside too scratched and faded to identify. Each discovery made him flicker brighter for a moment, a brief surge of energy, a fleeting return to a semblance of solidity. Then he would dim again, like faulty bulbs on a string, the light growing weaker and weaker. I started sleeping in the attic, surrounded by dusty boxes and forgotten memories, too afraid that if I blinked, if I left his sight for even a moment, he would dissolve entirely. I wanted to wrap myself around him, to physically hold him together, but my hands passed through him like smoke. He begged me to shower, to eat, to live my own life. "You can't stop living for a dead man," he'd whisper, his voice strained. And I, in turn, begged him to stay, to fight, to find a way. It was a stalemate of desperation, two souls trapped in a terrible, impossible limbo, watching time steal what little connection they had. Every day was a race against the inevitable, every moment a precious, terrifying gift. The hole in his chest seemed to mock us, a growing void threatening to swallow him whole. On the 30th night of his fading, a night when he was so transparent I could barely make out his features, he motioned me to the basement. I hated the basement. It was a damp, claustrophobic space with stone walls that wept even in the driest July, smelling of earth and decay. But I followed him without hesitation, my heart pounding with a desperate hope. He drifted towards a section of the wall behind the water heater, a place I'd avoided entirely, and pointed. There, hidden beneath decades of grime and cobwebs, were bricks loosened decades earlier, almost imperceptibly. My fingers, guided by his silent direction, found the exact spot. I pried them out, one by one, the gritty mortar crumbling under my touch. Inside the small, forgotten cavity, nestled like a secret, was a tin box. And inside that, a leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with age and handling. His handwriting, delicate and precise, looped across the yellowed pages like anxious birds taking flight. It was an intimate glimpse into his soul, a chronicle of his thoughts and fears. My eyes scanned, racing through the entries, searching for clues, for answers. And then I found it. The final entry, scrawled with a desperate urgency. If courage were currency, I'd be bankrupt. Printed apology tomorrow. If they hurt me, tell Ma the locket was for Annie. Tell Annie. The sentence hung unfinished, a silent scream frozen in time, a life brutally interrupted. I looked up, my own eyes stinging with unshed tears. Elias stood before me, his form flickering, tears shimmering on his translucent cheeks, tears he couldn't actually shed. I never gave Annie the locket, he whispered, his voice a ragged breath, filled with a century of regret. The pieces clicked into place, the locket we'd found in the attic. His unfinished business. My phone became my lifeline. I Googled Annie Clark, 1918, our city, and there it was, an obituary digitized from an old newspaper. She never married. She worked at the local library, a quiet, dedicated life. She died in 1983, a grand old age, and was buried in Riverside Cemetery. We had a place, a destination, a chance. I drove at dawn, the leather diary clutched in my lap, feeling like contraband, a stolen piece of history. Elias rode beside me, barely solid enough to reflect in the car window, a faint shifting image that made my heart ache. Riverside Cemetery was misty, the headstones glowing pale and ethereal in the early morning light, like silent sentinels guarding untold stories. We walked among them, Elias guiding me with subtle shifts of presence until we found her grave. Plain granite, no mention of a locket, no grand epitaph. Just her name and dates. I laid the flowers I'd bought, a simple bouquet of white roses, on the damp earth. Elias stood over the plot, his form wavering, mouthing words I couldn't catch, a silent century-late confession. For a single breathtaking heartbeat, he looked almost solid, almost truly there. Hope surged through me, a dizzying, intoxicating rush. Then, just as quickly, he flickered so violently the nearby bouquet trembled, the petals vibrating with the force of his instability. Back home, the hole in his chest had widened, now the size of an apple, a gaping maw threatening to consume him. Good thing I don't need lungs, he joked, a faint, desperate attempt at humor. I didn't laugh. My heart was too heavy, too full of dread. We had found Annie, but it wasn't enough. The apology was still unheard, the connection still incomplete. Internet forums, those strange digital repositories of all human belief and desperation, suggested a ritual. Speak the truth, gift the object, let the spirit choose passage or permanence. It sounded like hokey nonsense, the kind of new age fluff I'd usually scroll past with an eye roll. But when you're watching someone you love literally evaporate before your eyes, you'll try anything, even hokey nonsense. I bought candles, sage bundles, the whole cliché starter pack for amateur ghost whisperers. Elias, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes at my preparations, but he indulged me, sitting cross-legged opposite me on the attic floor, his translucent form a faint counterpoint to my frantic energy. The air was thick with the scent of sage and my own nervous anticipation. I opened the diary, its pages crinkling softly, and began to read aloud, my voice shaking at first, then gaining strength with each word. I read his hopes, his fears, his love for Annie. When I reached the final, heart-wrenching line, my voice cracked, a raw, emotional break. I forced myself to finish, to give his words the voice they deserved. Tell Annie I loved her. Silence. A silence heavier than stone, more profound than any I had ever experienced in this old house. Then a sudden gust of wind roared through the attic, though all the windows were firmly closed. The locket, still clutched in my palm, grew warm, radiating a gentle heat against my skin. Elias's outline sharpened, his form gaining a startling clarity. Color, faint but unmistakable, flushed his spectral cheeks. For a fleeting, glorious moment, I thought we'd done it. We'd fixed it. We'd found the answer, the key to his release. Instead, he screamed. A soundless agony that ripped through the air, a silent, primal shriek that vibrated through my very bones. His storm-glass eyes were wide with pure terror, reflecting a torment I couldn't comprehend. The hole in his chest, which had seemed to shrink for a moment, stopped spreading but didn't close. It remained a terrifying void. He mouthed 2 words, full of despair, "Not enough." And in that instant, a cold, sickening wave of realization washed over me. The mistake. The crucial century-old error. The apology hadn't been delivered to Annie directly. It had been delivered for her, to her grave. But the diary entry wasn't just about Annie. It was about his mother, about his own failure. And the most critical piece, the apology was undelivered to the living. Everyone who needed to hear it, everyone who could truly understand the context and accept his regret, was long since dust. How do you deliver a century-old sorry to people who ceased to exist decades ago? The ritual, the locket, the cemetery visit, they were all touching, meaningful gestures, but they weren't the active apology, the public acknowledgement, the public forgiveness that his spirit so desperately needed. We had stalled, not solved, and the clock was still ticking, his form still fading. The horror of it was almost unbearable. We needed a living witness. Someone who could hear, truly hear, Elias's unspoken apology and give it voice in the present. Someone who could bridge the vast chasm of time. My desperate online searches led me to Mara Clark, Annie's great-grandniece. She taught local history at the community college, a serendipitous detail that felt like a tiny, fragile thread of hope. I stalked her office hours, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. Picture me, a disheveled woman clutching a tarnished 1901 locket like a Victorian weirdo, trying to explain that my friend, a ghost mind you, had written a diary and needed to beg forgiveness for a century-old slight. I must have looked completely unhinged. Mara, to her credit, stared, skeptical but clearly intrigued by the historical value of the diary and the locket itself. Her historian's curiosity, thankfully, outweighed her natural inclination to call security. After an hour of me pouring out the wildest story she'd ever heard, punctuated by Elias's faint, encouraging presence, she agreed. We arranged a public apology, a reading of Elias's diary entries at the old public library where Annie Clark had worked for so many years. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but I figured enough townsfolk nostalgia, enough community interest in local history might just count as a crowd witness. A collective acknowledgement that could, perhaps, provide the final piece of Elias's puzzle. Elias, understandably, hesitated. "What if I disappear mid-sentence?" he whispered, his voice laced with fear. The thought was a cold knot in my stomach. What if all this effort, all this desperate hope, ended in public humiliation and the final, agonizing loss of him? I swallowed my own terror, forced a brave face. "Then we go out with style," I told him, trying to inject a lightness I didn't feel. "We make history, Elias, a ghost reading his own apology. That's a story for the ages." He laughed, a fragile, trembling sound like violin strings, but it was a laugh nonetheless. It was a pact, a desperate, beautiful gamble. The date was set, a full moon, 3 nights away. A symbolic touch, perhaps, or just a coincidence. Either way, it felt momentous. Elias faded faster each hour, his form growing increasingly indistinct, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I practiced the reading until my throat rasped, my voice hoarse from repeating his words, trying to imbue them with the emotion they deserved. He hovered, a faint, watchful presence, whispering corrections on the pronunciation of obsolete slang, or offering subtle nuances on the tone of a particular passage. We were racing the sun, racing the moon, racing against the relentless, unforgiving march of time. Every second felt precious, every breath a prayer. The night of the reading smelled of old paper and floor polish, a comforting, familiar scent that usually evoked quiet reverence, but tonight felt charged with a nervous energy. The small crowd gathered in the library's historic reading room was a motley crew. Retirees, students from Mara's history class, and a surprising number of random ghost hunters, drawn by the local buzz about Annie Clark's ghost story. Candles flickered on the podium, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic Elias's own unstable form. My palms were slick with sweat, clutching the diary pages so tightly I thought they might tear. Elias stood where the podium light met shadow, a half-gone silhouette, his presence barely more than a shimmer in the periphery of my vision. My voice shook at first, a weak, reedy sound, as I began to read his century-old words. But then a familiar ice-cold pressure settled gently on my shoulder, his version of a pep talk, a steadying, reassuring touch that went straight to my heart. My voice steadied, gaining a surprising strength, filling the hushed room. I poured my soul into his words, giving voice to his love, his regret, his desperate longing for understanding. Mara sat in the front row, clutching a faded sepia photograph of Annie, her expression a mix of academic interest and profound empathy. She was our anchor to the living, to the present. I read through Elias's heartfelt confessions, his youthful idealism, his anguish over his choices, and finally, the poignant, unfinished plea. I finished the last line, my voice clear and resonant, echoing through the silence. Tell Annie I loved her, and I'm sorry I never became the man she believed I could be. Silence. A profound, echoing silence that seemed to hold its breath. Then a ripple started. Applause. Soft at first, tentative, then swelling into a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that filled the room, shaking the very shelves. It wasn't just for my reading. It was for Elias, for Annie, for the story that had finally found its voice. And as the warmth of that collective emotion flooded the room, Elias gasped. A real, audible gasp. Color, faint but undeniable, rushed back into his cheeks. The thin scar, once almost invisible, stood out vividly on his left cheek. The gaping hole in his chest, which had been apple-sized only hours before, shrank before my eyes, closing until it was once again just a coin-sized imperfection. Hope spiked through me, sharp and exhilarating. We had done it. We had finally, truly released him. But he didn't vanish. He didn't move on. He simply stood there, more solid than I'd seen him in weeks, looking around the room with a bewildered, almost awestruck expression. We'd stalled his fading, not solved his ultimate dilemma. We had achieved a victory, yes, but it was a tiny victory, one that could fit inside a locket, a temporary reprieve, not a final resolution. The puzzle still had pieces missing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, we had time. Precious, fragile time. Back home, the night was still young, the air crisp and clear. We sat on the back steps, the moon a huge, benevolent orb hanging above the ancient oak trees, casting long silvery shadows across the yard. Crickets sang their endless, hypnotic chorus, a soundtrack to our strange, impossible night. Elias looked almost solid, the most vibrant I'd seen him since his initial appearance. The small coin-sized hole in his chest was still there, a reminder of his precarious state, but it felt less menacing, more like a healed wound than a gaping void. I whispered, my voice husky with exhaustion and a burgeoning hope. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow, Elias. We've earned a break." He turned his head, his storm-glass eyes shining with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, a deep, resonant sound. "Thank you for seeing me, for truly seeing me." My heart cracked open like old attic wood, a bittersweet ache that was both beautiful and terrifying. All the longing, all the unspoken affection, all the impossible love I felt for this man, this ghost, swelled within me. I leaned in, drawn by an irresistible force, a magnetic pull that defied all logic and reason. He met me halfway, a silent, mutual yearning bridging the infinitesimal space between us. Our lips brushed. It wasn't a kiss of flesh and blood, not in the conventional sense. It was a jolt of static electricity, a whisper of winter mint, a sudden, shocking fusion of cold and warmth. For a single, agonizing second, I felt him real, tangible, as real as regret, as undeniable as longing. His form solidified, a brief, perfect moment of connection. Then, just as quickly, he jerked back, a soundless cry escaping his lips. His form glitched, flickering violently like a bad radio reception, his carefully regained solidity shattering. The coin-sized hole in his chest snapped open, widening horrifyingly, faster than I could comprehend, until it was larger than my fist, a gaping abyss. He doubled over, gasping, a soundless spectral agony that tore through me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Love, it seemed, was exactly the thing tearing him apart. Our connection, our impossible affection, far from being his anchor, was instead the very force actively consuming him. It was a cruel cosmic joke. The profound emotional bond we shared, the very thing that had brought him back to me, was also the barrier preventing his final peace, his ultimate passage. My love, my desperate need for him to stay, was binding him to a painful, unraveling existence. The truth was a bitter pill, crushing all the hope that had blossomed just moments before. The horror of that moment, the way our touch had become a catalyst for his undoing, sent me into a frenzy. There was no more gentle Googling, no more casual forum browsing. This was full scholarly mode, a frantic, desperate dive into every obscure text, every dusty academic paper, every archived journal I could find. My mind raced, fueled by fear and a terrible dawning understanding. I stumbled upon it in a digitized 1899 pamphlet on spiritualism buried deep within a footnote. A spirit anchored by love must choose passage before the beloved as grief binds them painfully to the mortal coil causing dissolution. The words leaped off the screen, a chilling, undeniable truth. Translation: my desperation, my desperate, all-consuming love, was an anchor dragging him down, slowly but surely destroying him. To save him, to truly set him free, I had to let go. It was the cruelest, most ironic cosmic joke imaginable. The very thing I thought would save him was, in fact, killing him. I sat on the attic floor, the leather diary heavy in my lap, the locket gleaming dully beside it, a symbol of both our connection and our impending separation. Elias watched me, his storm glass eyes gentle, filled with a profound, heartbreaking understanding. "You know what to do," he whispered, his voice soft, resigned. I couldn't speak. The words were choked in my throat, trapped behind a dam of unshed tears. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I wanted to argue, to smash the universe until it rewrote its cruel, arbitrary rules, to find a loophole, a different path. But there was no arguing with this. The evidence was right there, etched into his fading form. He added, his voice a balm and a blade all at once, "I'd rather fade loving you than stay hurting you." And that was it, the ultimate act of love. His willingness to sacrifice his continued existence, however tenuous, to spare me the pain of watching him unravel, and to spare himself the agony of being bound by my grief. I cried until hiccups racked my body, until my chest ached more than my heartbreak, until there were no more tears left to shed. The realization was a devastating blow, but his words, his selfless love, gave me a strange, terrible strength. We had to plan a goodbye, and I hated every single second of it, even before it began. Every breath felt like a betrayal. Every moment spent planning our separation felt like a tiny death. Yet there was no other way. This was the only path to his peace and ultimately to mine. The next night, under the same full moon that had shone on our small victory at the library, I prepared for the ultimate farewell. I placed candles in a circle on the attic floor, their flames flickering softly, casting a warm, deceptive glow. I opened every window, even though it was chilly, so his scent, that familiar, comforting blend of cedar and coffee, could escape, could finally dissipate into the night air. I wore the peach cardigan he liked, the one he'd once complimented, saying it suited the warmth in my eyes. It felt like a small, private tribute, a final gesture of love. He hovered in the center of the candlelit circle, nearly transparent, his form so faint I had to strain to see him. The gaping hole in his chest was still there, a stark reminder of the reason for this painful ritual. I picked up the diary, its leather cover warm beneath my fingers, and began to read it one last time. My voice was steady, surprisingly so, because he deserved steadiness. He deserved strength in this final, hardest moment. I read not for answers, not for solutions, but for remembrance, for honor, for the sheer impossible beauty of his story. At the final word, the last echo of his century-old regret, I closed the book gently, placing the locket atop it. A tangible link to his past, a symbol of his love for Annie, and now, a vessel for his release. "I release you," I whispered, the words barely audible, tearing at my throat. "I release you, Elias. Go in peace." As if on cue, a wind, fierce and roaring, swept through the open windows, swirling around the attic, though there was no breeze outside. The candle flames guttered wildly, threatening to extinguish, but miraculously they stayed lit, dancing with an almost frantic energy. Elias smiled, not a smile of sadness, not of regret, but of pure, profound peace. It was a smile that reached his storm glass eyes, a quiet, joyful acceptance. "Live loudly," he said, his voice a soft, final sigh carried on the wind. I forced a nod, unable to speak, unable to move, and then a light. Not a blinding flash, but a soft internal burst, like sunrise through closed eyelids, radiating from his very core. It expanded, enveloping his translucent form, and then, as quickly as it came, it receded, leaving behind quiet, an empty room. Still candles, gone. I stood alone, my lungs aching with the silence, so profound it felt like an echo in a vast, empty canyon. Some people I've heard think that ghosts leaving feels like relief, like a burden lifted, but it doesn't. Not when you've loved them. It feels like an amputation without blood, a searing pain where something vital used to be. The space he occupied, the space he had carved out in my heart and in this house, was now a gaping void, colder than any cold spot. The silence was no longer comforting. It was deafening. The days blurred into a monotonous, painful cycle. Eat, shower, answer emails. The practicalities of life, a grim mantra against the crushing weight of absence. I lectured myself on practicality, on moving forward, on the supposed victory of his release. But the house felt surgically clean of his presence, too quiet, too still, and I hated that victory. I hated the emptiness, the lack of that familiar chill, that phantom scent. 1 week later, I found it. A sketch, tucked carefully onto my nightstand, placed there sometime between my last frantic search and my exhausted collapse into sleep. It was a drawing of me, asleep, my hair fanned out like an ink spill across the pillow. Beneath it, in his distinctive, elegant script, were the words, "Thank you for the year of Sundays." The paper felt warm in my hands, impossibly warm, as if it still held the echo of his touch. I laughed, a raw, ragged sound, and then I cried. I cried until my ribs protested, until my body was racked with sobs, a mixture of grief and gratitude and a profound, aching love. He was gone, but he had left a piece of himself, a final, beautiful gesture. I hung the drawing on the wall opposite my bed, so it would be the first thing I saw each morning, a silent promise, a gentle reminder. Sometimes when music plays, when a particularly poignant melody fills the air, the overhead bulb in the living room flickers twice, a quick, almost imperceptible blink. And I smile. I keep dancing. Because love, I've learned, doesn't obey physics, neither does memory. And Elias, in his own way, was still here. I started sketching again, something I hadn't done since college, something I'd long since abandoned. Each line I drew felt like a conversation, a connection to that part of myself he had reawakened. Maybe, just maybe, that's haunting enough. A gentle, creative haunting that keeps his spirit alive in my own. The silence was still there, but now it was punctuated by the rustle of my sketchbook pages, the scratch of my pencil, a different kind of presence. Tonight marks exactly 1 month since he left. 30 long, empty days. I'm recording this story, whispering it into the digital ether, because the isolation had begun to creep back in, heavy and suffocating as cobwebs. I was sitting in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of our frantic searches, a bottle of cheap wine clutched in my hand, my resolve even cheaper. Mid-sip, the air around me chilled. Not a sudden Arctic blast, but a soft, familiar coolness, like a breath against my skin. Cedar and coffee. My heart, which I thought had healed into a dull ache, stuttered, then began to pound with a frantic, disbelieving rhythm. Before I could even speak, before I could even form a question, a warmth circled my waist. Not a physical embrace, not a solid touch, but a pressure, distinct and undeniable, like remembered arms. It was him. His voice, softer than moth wings, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, floated into my consciousness. Finished business isn't the same as finished love. Tears, hot and unexpected, spilled down my cheeks, blurring my vision. But you're free, I choked out, a raw, desperate plea for understanding. And you're still grieving, he murmured, the phantom pressure at my waist tightening infinitesimally. Anchors work both ways. I felt him smile against my hair, a sensation of pure, gentle affection that brought a fresh wave of tears. I can't stay, he murmured, a familiar, heartbreaking truth. But I can walk you home whenever you're lost. A light pulsed, soft and warm, then slowly receded, taking the chill with it, but leaving behind the indelible scent of cedar and coffee. I sat there, shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming flood of emotion. Not alone, not abandoned. Some hauntings, I realized, are not about fear or terror or unfinished business in the traditional sense. Some hauntings are promises wearing different clothes, promises of continued connection, of a love that transcends the boundaries of life and death, of a presence that, while not physical, is undeniably real. He was gone, but he wasn't truly gone. He had simply changed form, shifted his presence, found a way to be there without being bound. The cosmic joke, it seemed, had a tender punchline after all. Love doesn't end death. That much I know with absolute certainty. But it does learn boundaries. It has to. Elias, in his wisdom and his love, taught me that. He visits in flickers now, a sudden, inexplicable shift in the light, the faint ghost of his scent, a new sketch appearing on my nightstand on a particularly rainy day. These aren't random occurrences. They are his gentle greetings, his quiet reminders that he's still near. I stopped trying to hold him, to bind him to my world. Instead, I greet the signs. I acknowledge his presence, and then I keep living loudly, just like he ordered. I date living humans. I laugh at their bad jokes. I leave windows open for possibility, for new experiences, for all the messy, beautiful chaos of a human life. It's not a betrayal of my love for Elias, it's an honoring of it. It's living the life he couldn't, embracing the world he had to leave behind. Some nights, when the mood is right, when the conversation is deep and honest, I tell new friends this story. They laugh, of course. They call me creative, imaginative, a gifted storyteller. I just shrug, a small smile playing on my lips. Belief isn't currency, it's shelter. It's a comfort, a way of understanding the inexplicable, of finding meaning in the unseen. So if you ever feel a cold, gentle presence, a subtle shift in the air that feels almost like a touch, speak. Don't be afraid. Tell them about now, about later, about hope. Tell them about your day, your dreams, your fears. Maybe they'll answer. Maybe they'll just listen. Either way, you both feel less alone. And if you're lucky enough to fall for a ghost, love them like a sunrise. Fully, completely, knowing it can't last forever, knowing they're transient and ethereal, but understanding that the memory of that light, the warmth of that impossible connection, might just last you a lifetime. It might just be enough to guide you through the darkest nights. So if you've seen something you can't quite explain, something that defied logic but touched your heart, or if you've loved someone the world insists isn't real, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and who knows, maybe Elias does too. He always was a bit of a curious soul. If you connected with this strange, beautiful tale, if it made you feel seen or gave you a shiver of hope, please like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want more strange, true things whispered your way. And hey, if a light flickers twice while you're watching, right when I say this, that's probably just him saying hi back. A little nod from across the veil. So yes, I fell in love with a ghost, and technically, he never really left. He just changed shape. Love does that, doesn't it? It's a transformative force. It turns flesh into story, story into map, map into compass. It points you forward even when you feel lost, urging you to keep walking. The house is quieter now, certainly without his constant presence, but the echoes are kind. They're filled with warmth and memory, not sorrow. I still drink my coffee from the chipped mug. I still dance alone in the living room to whatever playlist promises courage, letting the music fill the spaces he once occupied. And every full moon, I leave the locket on the windowsill, a small, open invitation, just in case he wants to come home for a visit. Because love isn't about possession. It's about recognition. It's about seeing. I see you, Elias. You see me. And in that mutual recognition, we both keep moving in our own ways, through our own worlds. That's the real spell. That's the magic that truly endures.